Over the past 4 or 5 years, both my parents have been in Rotherham Hospital. They've both got Alzheimer's, so they've both been in for a variety of different conditions. As a nurse, I've been nursing for over 20 years, and I think one of the things that strikes me really is the basic level of care, and the awareness of the situation is not always there. My mum was being assessed by the nurse and it was doing a pulse oximetry, so a level of oxygen, and it was low, and that would make you think that person's got respiratory problems, or there would be some other signs that it was low, and there weren't any. My mum wasn't breathless, so she's not showing any signs, but she'd actually got nail varnish on, and it's awkward as a nurse not to dive in there and say things, but just to highlight that. Do you think it's the nail varnish? And after that response, the nurse actually just turned the probe the other way round rather than thinking, that won't work. So it's just an awareness of, that's why the measurement is low, because she's got nail varnish on, and that's one of the first things you learn when you're doing that measurement. And perhaps we need to get another probe to do it somewhere else. And then another example would be, and this has happened on a number of occasions, not just in the last admission, and one of the most basic things we do is observing a nurse taking a blood pressure on my mum with a big thick jumper on, and that happened with my dad as well in A&E, but this was on the ward, and it was done 3 times, and after that it's quite uncomfortable with a machine rather than a manual. And so it was quite uncomfortable, and she couldn't get a reading because there was too many obstructions there, and then the nurse blamed it on the machine, saying it was old, but both me and my husband, who's not a nurse, both thought it's because of the clothing, it's not on the skin at all, or even a thin t-shirt, and then went to get another machine and it didn't pick up, and then it leads you to think, even if it had picked up, that measurement wouldn't have been right, and then that measurement would have been passed on to the doctors, who would have then made a decision about blood pressure medication or about fluids and things. So it has a knock-on effect. It was also, my mum had a mastectomy, and no one was aware whether she'd had any other, limbs removed, but she'd got a red armband on, and the blood pressure was done every single time on the affected arm that she'd had a mastectomy on. So it's just being aware of that situation when you're doing basic measurements. And I think the last thing was just the process of discharge. So in the old days, when I worked on the wards and we used to do discharge, we used to go through all the medication and the form. Are you happy with discharge? These are the medications that you're going home with. And my husband actually went to collect my mum, and she went home on an anti-cancer drug when actually she should have been going home on antibiotics. She was already on a regular anti-cancer drug, and she went home on that. There was no antibiotic. If I'd have not been aware that drug was not an antibiotic, then she would have just been left out in the community with no antibiotic treatment, with a chest infection, and the next time she would have been picked up would probably be a readmission into hospital. So there was no check on the drugs that were going home. There's no checks. That was something we always used to do on the wards, is sit down with the relative or the patient and go through everything that was done. But it wasn't, so. And the worrying thing is, if nurses are making these basic, I hate to say mistakes, but not being aware of the basic things, then how can we expect our nursing associates and our auxiliaries to follow suit and have role models we're expecting people who are now not qualified to do them? So, like I said, it's not that I'm looking for excellent care and looking at the most technical tasks. They're things like blood pressures, pulse oximetries, temperatures, and discharge home, which I think you do on day probably the first week of your nurse training.